Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story tells about a girl who sacrificed absolutely everything in order to make others happy. Even though she was the one who was not loved, she was able to help others by accepting a marriage proposal from a rather influential person. In this way, she could become a desirable bride. And even if her fiancé hated her to the point of wanting to kill her, she was ready to make such sacrifices. In fact, the Empire of Virgil, where the girl lived, owned rich lands overlooking the most beautiful blue sea. In this empire, there was a great duke named Clono, and he was also known as the watchdog of the empire. He led a family of great knights and magicians, and they all struck fear into the hearts of people. However, when the head of the family turned 30, he irreversibly went mad. It had already become a small tradition, and in the end, death and the complete destruction of his whole life awaited him. However, there was one small way to remove this terrible curse. It was marriage with the chosen one of God himself. And then one day a poor girl named Rooney was cornered. A man who came into her office where she was quietly reading started to pester her. He pinned her against the wall and told her that she had been in this place after all, and also asked if she was too old to play hide and seek. Rooney, who was the youngest child of Count Persephone, turned to her brother in an anxious voice and asked if he really wanted something from her. The man was Nike. He was the eldest child of Count Persephone and, looking at the girl with disgust, said that she, as usual, was completely emotionless, and this irritated him. But at that moment he grabbed her by the neck and said that it was time to teach her how to seduce a man. He moved closer to her ear and quietly told her to listen carefully. He also added that she was obliged to smile sweetly, and that the smile should in no way be hypocritical or arrogant. Rooney was getting really annoyed with the whole situation. Even though they had different mothers, her older brother was always pestering his little sister, and she really hoped he would stop. In order to protect herself from him, she moved away and said that she did not want strange rumors to be spread about him, the future heir of their family. So she, moving away from him, asked him not to worry about her. She could stand up for herself and, if necessary, learn what was needed. However, when Nike heard about the rumors, he blocked her path with his hand and asked what kind of idiot would gossip about him and her, a little dog, because she licked her owner's hand. As soon as the girl heard this, she was very surprised. She froze in place and was ready to fall through the ground, just not to be next to her brother at that moment. However, the man came closer and closer to her and said that the people of this estate did not care about her at all, so she should not worry about it at all. As soon as Rooney heard this, she became even more worried. She knew very well that in the whole house there was not a single place for her and a person who could support her. However, the girl had nowhere to go. But at the moment when Nike was about to commit terrible things against her, the girl was saved by a maid who ran into the room. She turned to the lady and said that the Count was calling her because she had received a very important letter. And so some time passed from that moment. Rooney came into her father's room. He smiled and said that she could rejoice because they had received an imperial order. He then handed the girl a piece of paper with a letter and said that she had been chosen as a marriage partner for Lord Helios of the Clonoa Duke's family. As soon as she heard about it, she was very surprised and could not believe that it would really be a wedding. The woman who was standing next to her father at the time said that she certainly had the right to refuse it. However, her father, smiling maliciously, said that even such a stupid girl as she should be perfectly aware of how good it was that he had spared her life after all. Of course, the poor girl was always considered an unwanted child, and that is why no one cared about her at all. Her late mother had married only for convenience. However, her father had a mistress and a son who was older than her. And after some time, her father's mistress became the second wife. And, unlike Rooney's brother, the future head, she was simply a burden that had no meaning to exist. However, she understood that if she got married, she would be able to leave this terrible place. But before the girl could say a single word, Nike suddenly intervened in the conversation and shouted that he was against it. The boy also continued to yell at his parents and said that he couldn't believe that his sister was being given to the terrible Hades. Rooney stood next to him at that moment, surprised, and did not understand why he was suddenly defending her like that. However, the boy's father suddenly looked at him angrily and asked when he had ever asked his opinion on any important issues, especially those concerning his sister. He also explained to his son that the choice of a bride was a decision given to the priest by God, so his opinion was definitely not taken into account. At that moment, the boy's mother applauded and said that it was simply wonderful, because the problematic girl would no longer be in their estate, and the emperor would even be in their debt. In fact, This guy was called Hades because he had a powerful force. However, if you became his relative, this force would never turn against him or his family. The father approached Ronnie and asked if she understood this. The girl answered with a trembling voice that she understood everything perfectly. And after some time of reflection, she said that she would gladly fulfill their request. In fact, the girl believed that accepting this offer would be a real salvation for her, and she would finally leave this estate. Some time passed since then. Ronnie was dressed in a wedding dress and sent straight to the groom. In fact, his family was quite special. There was no personal meeting or engagement planning. One moonless night, the girl simply arrived at the estate in a luxurious wedding dress in order to be married. The only people who met her were the estate's servants, who lined up on either side to escort her inside. As Ronnie walked forward, she thought that this was like marrying the demon lord of the underworld. She tried to calm herself down and kept telling herself in her head that everything was okay. It was better than staying in that estate with no future for herself and a terrible brother who was constantly harassing her. As the girl walked forward, a man in a rather handsome uniform came out to meet her. He came closer to her and apologized for inviting her so suddenly. This man was Helios, and he bowed and greeted the girl. As soon as Ronnie raised her head up and saw the appearance of this man, she was genuinely surprised. She looked at him and realized that this guy was the one people called Hades. She stood face to face with her future husband, whom she had never seen before, and she even shuddered at the thought. The girl was silent for a while. Then she bowed low and told him her name. She also said that she would sacrifice her life to serve his family. Ronnie remained in this position for some time, and she herself was very surprised and could not believe that he really turned out to be very handsome. Of course, she had long before this meeting prepared herself for the fact that he would look like the devil incarnate. However, in the end, it turned out to be completely different. The man was very surprised for a moment. He could not understand why she was saying that she would sacrifice her life. But then he took her by the waist and pulled her closer to him. He held her hand, and Ronnie was very surprised at that moment because she could not even remember the last time someone touched her to show respect and not to hurt her. Of course, Ronnie looked at him in surprise and did not understand why this man was acting like a gentleman. She was told that they had no use for her for a long time. However, now she had become the wife of Mr. Helios and was going to try to be useful to this estate. The girl wanted to do absolutely everything in her power to please this man and live up to his expectations. After some time, the man brought her into his office, and on the table lay a small box with a ring. Seeing her surprised look, he lowered his head and said that she didn't have to wear it at all. However, if she only wore it in public, people wouldn't make much of a fuss. Rooney was very surprised at this moment. She even became a little worried and immediately asked what he meant when he said such things. The man then sighed heavily and said that he would tell her straight out, namely, that he was not going to spend their wedding night with her. And anyway, he didn't want to spend a single night with her. As soon as Rooney heard this, she was genuinely surprised. She turned to him with a trembling voice and asked, "Does this mean that they now have a white marriage?" The man shook his head and said that it was exactly like that. In fact, a white marriage is a marriage in which the spouses consciously renounce sexual relations, pursuing exclusively spiritual goals for themselves. The girl was silent for a while. Then she turned to Mr. Helios and wanted to say something, but quickly changed her mind when she saw his sad expression. She knew very well that his family was excellent in magic and swordsmanship, and some even said that they held most of the empire's military might in their hands. However, in exchange for great power, this family was cursed by a great magician, and when the head of the family turns 30, he goes crazy and simply dies. Rooney also knew very well that the only way to escape this was to spend the night with the bride chosen by God and conceive a child. So it came as an incredibly huge surprise to her that he voluntarily gave it up. Then suddenly, Helios turned to her and said that if she didn't like it, then she could calmly return to the Count's estate. He had no intention of keeping her there by force. Rooney replied in a trembling voice that she had no intention of going home, so she asked him to let her stay. The man replied that she could do as she pleased. However, he had no intention of loving her, so he warned her in advance so that the girl would not even count on it. So she stayed to live in that estate and understood perfectly well that if things continued like this, he would simply die, and she was the only person who could save him. However, even in this situation, she could not help him in any way. After all, she still had no right to exist. She was simply there in order to not be near her family. Rooney had always been told that she was useless, but now she was the only one who could break this curse and save an innocent human soul. One evening, returning from a walk to the estate, the man suddenly noticed flowers standing on the windowsill. He was immediately very surprised and asked where they came from. Rooney, who was nearby, immediately said that it was her, and also apologized for doing something selfish without even asking permission. The man's eyes were blank and he said in a quiet voice that it was no big deal. He had a guest coming in a few hours, so everything was fine. He simply turned around and started walking towards his office, keeping his head down. He also said that he didn't care about such things, so she didn't have to ask his permission. But then he suddenly stopped, and to the girl's great surprise, said that these flowers were really beautiful, even though he was not a great connoisseur of art. In fact, Rooney was incredibly appreciative of the gentleman's kindness towards her. Even though they were not real husband and wife, she still could not believe that he would die at such an early age. Of course, the girl wanted incredibly much to help him, thereby repaying the kindness he showed to her. Some time had passed since then, and now winter had set in. Many priests and even the commander of the knights were very worried about Mr. Helios. They were irritated by his stubbornness. Many priests waited patiently for him to change his mind before he died, but they came to the conclusion that his mind would never change. And this made them very sad, because the end of the Klonoa family meant the destruction of the entire empire. They urgently needed a child, so the men turned to Mrs. Rooney and said that it was her job to take some action and insist on her own way so that the man would not die and the empire would not fall with him. The men decided to help her a little. They prepared tea for the girl, which she was supposed to take to her husband, and a special potion that was supposed to make her task easier. Rooney, of course, listened to them. She took the tea to the man. Of course, the girl was used to being completely unloved by anyone. The moment Helios drank his tea to the bottom, he suddenly felt strange. His heart began to ache, his breathing became stronger, and he even lost his balance. In fact, even though Rooney never knew true love from her parents or anyone else, she still wanted to be very useful to anyone and help them in any way she could. She understood that if she could help Helios, she would be able to live with this wonderful memory. In fact, that night 7 years ago, she escaped from the mansion, and when it was all over, she was incredibly scared. She had broken the white marriage contract, and even though it was a priest's order, it was no big deal. If Helios had killed her when he realized she was the one who gave him the medicine, it wouldn't have surprised her. So the girl couldn't stay there any longer and look into the man's eyes, so she decided to just leave. But in reality, Rooney had no regrets at all. She was given 2 beautiful children who were incredibly beautiful and sweet. Their names were Helios and Uranus, and her dear sun and sky became the meaning of the girl's whole life. She lived only for them. One day, Helios ran up to his mother, who was outside, and said that the head maid had called her because of a certain guest. The girl, taking her sons by the hand, immediately went towards the estate and asked, "Is this really the tailor? After all, the gentleman recently asked me to mend his coat." The boy answered her that he certainly did not know. However, he did not look like a tailor. This was already spoken by Uranus, who also saw this man. And the moment Rooney approached the entrance to the estate, she actually saw the man who came there, and it was not the tailor. When she raised her head a little higher, she saw Helios in front of her, who could not take his eyes off her. The man said in a serious voice that he had finally found her, since it had taken him quite a long time. For some time she stood in complete silence and could not understand anything. She certainly did not expect to see this man. At that moment, one of the sons approached her and asked his mother who he was. Rooney knew perfectly well that it would be simply terrible if people found out that they were his children, so she replied that he was a duke from a neighboring country, and they were old acquaintances. Then she asked the children to go back to the mansion and do something, and she would soon come to them. She understood that she had to do everything so that the children would not find out anything about this man, and would not even suspect anything. And all because that night she spent with Mr. Helios, she saw something. At that moment, as she was running through the forest with only one bag of things, the girl noticed something strange. She accidentally tripped over a rock and fell, and then, looking at her bag, she noticed a small shiny ring. Taking it in her hands, Rooney realized that she had completely forgotten to leave it at the estate. It was a ring that also had the Klonoa family crest engraved on it, and at that moment she suddenly saw some kind of vision. 2 boys who had grown up stood opposite each other and were very angry. She realized that these 2 boys were fighting for the family crest of this family. The girl did not know whether it was just a vision or a dream, but it scared her very much. Rooney didn't know if it would actually happen, but she was lucky to have twins. When she had 2 boys, she was even happy that she was able to see a prophetic dream. Because of the Klonoa family's blood, which possessed amazing magical powers, These children were born completely healthy and beautiful. But she also understood that if these boys got involved with the man's family, they would simply hate each other. That's why she had to hide the information about the birth of the twins all this time. Rooney stood and looked at the man for a while, but then she smiled and said that she was very glad that he was okay after all. In fact, if Mr. Helios hadn't spent the night with her, he would have gone crazy and destroyed the empire by the age of 18. So she was truly glad that she had been able to prevent that. But at that moment, he came closer to her and said in an icy voice that she had done too much. The girl was very surprised. She already wanted to say something, but did not have time, because the man asked when he had asked her for help, and did not understand why she decided to act on her own. Rooney couldn't believe that he was really that angry, and even suggested that for some reason he was unhappy that he had survived. However, Helios remained angry and asked why she ran away from the estate, leaving him completely alone in such a situation. The girl understood perfectly well that he was unhappy with this situation. However, she even managed to assume that most likely he was looking for her all this time in order to punish her for disobedience. Rooney was about to say something. Meanwhile, she began to slowly walk back. In fact, she understood that she was a selfish bride, a disgrace to the Duke who could even be killed. But as she pressed herself against the tree, the man put his hands in such a way that she could not get out, and continued asking her why she ran away. When Rooney turned and looked him in the eye, she noticed that they were very close, and the man asked her to answer a question. She hesitated for a while, but then said it was because she knew he didn't want to spend the night with her. As soon as Helios heard this, he was very surprised and asked what she meant. And the girl became too ashamed and sad, so she turned away from him. In fact, it is well known in social circles that Mr. Helios of the Klonoa family was a childhood friend of the princess, and they were on good terms. However, the oracle of the church chose her as his daughter-in-law, and this marriage was to remove this terrible curse from him. Rooney, looking down, said that his heart probably belonged to another girl. However, she was also fine with that. She did not want to object in any way, and so she simply left so as not to interfere with his happiness. She was glad that she had finally been able to do something she could be proud of in her life. And besides, he had been able to free himself from the curse, and that was the most important thing. She looked him straight in the eyes and with a smile on her face asked him to just forget about her. After all, now he could marry the princess and they could live happily ever after. As soon as Helios heard this, he was very surprised and asked why she was talking about the princess. But no one had time to say anything else, because the girl's children ran up to them with sticks in their hands and started shouting at the man. They were very angry and asked him to let their mother go. Also, Uranus, pointing a stick at him, said that he would beat everyone who mocked her and would not let her be offended under any circumstances. As soon as Rooney saw them, she was very surprised. She already wanted to try to calm the boys down, but she didn't have time. And all because the man, by waving only one hand, was able to lift Uranus up, and he could not reach anyone. The guy was very worried. He started yelling at the man and asked what he was doing. And his brother at that moment told the man to let him go and leave their family alone. But at that moment, another man with purple hair appeared behind them. He smiled and said that this was to be expected from the head of the Klonoa family. Not only was he good at fencing, but he was also no slouch in his use of magic. Uranus at that moment looked at the gentleman and immediately asked him to help his mother, because he could not do anything because he was still in the air. But after some time, this leviation bubble burst, and the man grabbed the two boys. Rooney immediately tried to calm them all down and said that everything was not so. She was the nanny of these children in the estate, and the boys simply misspoke. She had already tried to prove that these were not her children at all, but she didn't have time, because Helios spoke before she could say anything. He looked at the man and said that Rooney was his wife and he had come to finally take her home. As soon as the girl heard this, she looked at him in great surprise. She couldn't believe that he was actually saying something like that, and she also didn't understand why he would suddenly take her away. She stood a few steps away from the man and could not understand why Mr. Helios had come and found her in order to take her back to the estate. And besides all this, she really didn't want her children to be called his children as well, because that meant that everything would not go as she had planned from the very beginning. At this point, Helios was about to put the children down. He also turned to the girl and said that they called her mom, so he wanted to hear some explanation. Rooney immediately began to protest and said that this was not the case at all, and that she was simply their nanny. But the man, raising his voice at her, asked her not to lie. He never wanted to hear that cheap lie again. They were both silent for a while. Then he asked in a quiet voice if these were her children. The girl had no choice but to tell the truth, so she lowered her head and said that it was indeed so. Then the man continued to ponder further. But who is their father? And at that moment, as he was about to say this, he was interrupted. It was the purple-haired man standing nearby who turned to Duke Klonoa and asked him to let the children go to Earth. Some time passed since then, and they all moved back to the estate to sort out all the questions about what to do next. The man was approached by Adonis Corneli, who was the duke of a neighboring country. He said that his reputation had spread throughout the continent, but now he understood why he had gone from country to country so desperately. He just wanted to find Rooney. Then he told the story about how this girl was sheltered in a monastery. In addition, she did not hesitate to talk about the origin of her children. Therefore, he also did not delve into all the details. He came closer to Helios and said that he wanted her and the children to live in peace and quiet, so he took them in. The man was silent for a while, then said that everything was fine now, but Rooney was his wife, and he was going to take her back home. The girl, hearing this, was a little worried. She asked him to wait. I then said that I left home without permission and thought that he had divorced her a long time ago because of this. She also said that she had been married to him for less than a year, and they could not even be called a couple. After all, they did not communicate at all during their life together and did not communicate. But then suddenly the man grabbed her hand and asked, "Does she seriously think that they can't call each other husband and wife after what happened?" Then the girl thought about it seriously, but did not answer. The Duke of another country spoke. He thoughtfully said that it was true. The stability of the Virgilian Empire relied on the military and magical power of the Klonoa family. And now that it has been decided that the princess will be handed over, the question of succession to the throne has arisen, and naturally his family finds itself at the center of all attention. The man hugged the children, who were standing nearby at that moment and did not understand anything, and said that it was not good that they were allowing her, his wife, to run away from him. As soon as Rooney heard something about the princess, she immediately turned to him and, looking at him, asked what he meant. The Duke, who had given her shelter, replied with a smile on his face that it had been decided that she would marry the prince of their country and would not inherit the imperial line of Virgil. The rest of the royal family are younger cousins, and it is likely that the Klonoa family would have been involved in national politics for some time. As soon as Rooney heard all this, she immediately realized that Mr. Helios had no connection with the princess, and this surprised her very much. But she realized that this meant that he had decided to simply use her again, of course. This time she was completely against this turn of events. Rooney didn't want to involve her dear children in all this, because she had been haunted all day by the way the boys had turned against each other in a struggle for succession to the throne. So, with her head down, she turned to the man and asked him to just leave her and marry her again. But the man interrupted her mid-sentence and replied in a serious voice that he was not going to get divorced and would also take her back home to the castle. He also said that she could tell her family that she had twins, because he thought they should know. Helios said that there were endless wars over money in her home, and after the divorce she would have no other choice, because the question of inheritance will arise, and then the younger brother will consider her children as his own enemies. As soon as Rooney heard this, she was very surprised. She asked in a trembling voice, "Is he really threatening her?" But the man replied that this was not true at all. He told her about it only to protect her and the children. In fact, the Klonoa family was the most important family in the empire, and to tarnish their name was the same as to defame the entire empire. The girl had no right to resist, because she herself understood perfectly well what course of events awaited her in the future. So after some thought, she agreed. Rooney made this decision because the children she saw in her vision were teenagers, so she still had time to fix everything. Smiling, she said that she agreed to return to the castle and talk about a peaceful divorce, so that both parties would agree to it. Some time had passed since then. The whole family had collected their things and were already sitting in Helios's carriage, which was supposed to take them back to the estate. The Duke, who had arranged for the girl to be employed, came out to see them off and told them to have a good journey. The man was very kind and said that they could think of his estate as their home and feel free to return at any time if needed. Of course, the children, who had already become incredibly attached to him, were very upset when they had to leave and say goodbye, so some even cried. When Helios approached the man to say goodbye to him, he stopped him and asked, "Wasn't it he who ordered her to be guarded 3 years ago?" The guy didn't answer. The Duke asked why he wanted to return this girl right now, what he was hiding. Helios did not answer, but simply got into his carriage, and they set off on their journey. Rooney and the children were riding in one carriage, and the man was sitting in another. It was already well dark outside, and they were still riding. Helios, who was very sensitive, turned to his mother and said that he did not want to live in the house with this terrible man. However, the brother who was holding the book in his hands turned to him and said that everything was fine because they could return to the master later when mother had sorted out all her affairs. Then he showed one article from the book and said that in the neighboring state where they were heading, there was a seed just like in the description and in the pictures. He smiled with joy and admiration and said that he would really like to see it live. Then the boys began to discuss some topic, and Rooney just watched all this. Seeing his joyful expression, she suddenly turned to the boy and asked what kind of book he was talking about, since she had never heard of anything like it. The boy then handed his mother a book and said that he had received it from the gentleman and that it told of a legend connected with twins. The text was written in an ancient language which made it incomprehensible to them. However, the gentleman was able to read the book to them, and it turned out to be very interesting and fascinating. As soon as Rooney picked it up, she was very surprised. It was called Heavenly Dragon and the Sword of the Sun. Then she immediately thought of her sons and could not understand whether this could be a simple coincidence or some kind of sign. In fact, the book talked about how there was a world consisting of heaven and earth. Dragons lived in the sky while ordinary people lived on the earth. And one day there appeared a man who was very fond of these dragons. He became a monarch and ruled the earth with their help. When his wife gave birth to twins, she died tragically. And having shared the power of the dragons, the twins soon began to conflict and realized that they were the future rulers of the earth. Rooney, when she read all this, was simply horrified. She could not understand what it was all about. But after reading the story to the end, she realized that it directly concerned them. The Klonoa family possessed supernatural military and magical abilities. And in this place, the same thing is repeated as in the prophetic dream, where the twins clash with each other for power. Well, when Rooney read that the wife died in the story, she couldn't believe that she was destined to pass away. The girl closed the book and, looking at her sons, could not believe that she was really going to die soon. And the boys at that moment continued to discuss this story. Uranus said that he really liked it when the two of them defeated the dragon. He also liked the moment when a doctor from a neighboring country provides assistance to a sick mother. When Rooney heard this, she was very surprised, because there was no scene where they defeat the dragon together, and it was clearly stated that their mother died. She was surprised by the fact that the boys were now talking about other developments, and then she realized that the gentleman had probably just told them a lie so as not to traumatize the children. Helios then suddenly giggled and told his brother that this doctor reminded him a little of the master, because he was kind and gave the twins books, so they were very happy. Rooney, who was sitting opposite them, watching their happy faces, thought that it was, of course, a lie. It was bad, but it was for the good. Then suddenly Uranus turned to her and said that if she had any difficulties, then the Lord would definitely help her. So they really hoped that she would quickly do all her work, and they would return back to the master. And so, from that moment on, several more hours passed, and already late at night, they finally got back to the Hades estate. When the children went inside, they were very surprised, because they did not expect to see such a large, luxurious mansion. The boys were a little confused at first. Then the gentleman spoke, sighing heavily. He told them to use the eastern part of the house at their own discretion. They could take any room they liked. In fact, his family's mansion was indeed very large, and as Rooney walked through it, she noticed that nothing had changed there in 7 years. When the girl passed by the coat of arms, she thought that if she had any connection with this family, then everything would happen the same way as in that terrible story. She truly believed that these stories were similar, and therefore she could not allow herself to die. So the girl was going to leave this estate immediately. When she had put her children to bed and changed into her nightgown, she went to the Duke's bedroom to talk to him. Seeing him in his nightgown, she apologized for coming so late, but explained that she was planning to go to a neighboring state the next day and would like to discuss their divorce. As soon as she saw the bed against the background of the man, she immediately remembered the events of the past and realized that she should not have entered that forbidden room back then. She remembered everything about that night perfectly, so the girl even felt uncomfortable. She pulled the blanket more over her body so that it covered all the details. In fact, that day she also looked at this man in a similar way as now. But now the man looked at her more with pity and very seriously. The man suddenly suggested that they go out into the fresh air for a while so that they could take their minds off the whole situation and think carefully about everything. Rooney didn't really mind. She followed her husband. When they went outside, he said that there were things he hadn't even told his wife about. He also added that there was no guarantee that someone in the mansion would not find out about it. Rooney had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. However, she did not dare ask questions. But Hayden explained that he was now a warrior, the prime minister of this country, and could support the crown prince in his quest to become the next emperor. However, the situation was not as simple as it might seem. He said that he would inherit the throne and become emperor, and she would be not only the duke's wife, but also the empress of this entire land. When Rooney heard this, she was very surprised. She was silent for a while, not even knowing what to answer. Of course, she was shocked by the fact that Mr. Hayden would now become the emperor, and she would automatically become the empress. With a heavy sigh, she asked him to wait for a while. She wanted to discuss something with him, and the girl said that some time ago, she learned that the princess was going to marry a man from a neighboring state, and now she finds out that her husband will be the heir to the throne. So she said that people probably still believe that the Klonoa family supports him. However, the emperor nevertheless declared that the duke should inherit the throne. He explained that appointing a young heir would only lead to the possibility of intervention by other countries. It was also a well-known fact that the stability of the state was strengthened by the military power of the dynasty, and that only he would be able to control important aspects of national policy. He explained that this was why a man needed to become emperor. It was his desire and the desire of the whole people. When Hayden explained this to the girl, she now finally understood that this was the main reason why he wanted her back so much. She came closer to him and said that breaking off the marriage with her and entering into a new union with another was quite the right decision for him. And she also asked with sadness in her voice why he cared about her fate. She thought about the head of the Klonoa family becoming emperor, and she wondered if the future where the twins were fighting for the succession was related to that situation. The girl understood that they had to prevent such a development of events, so she said that 7 years ago she was still grateful to him for the opportunity to leave Persephone's family by marrying him. She wanted to help this man who was destined to die at a very early age, and she felt joy in helping. However, now she has children that she needs to protect at all costs, so Rooney cannot stay in this house because she knows it will be very dangerous. She, looking him straight in the eyes, said that she could not be the wife of His Majesty the Emperor, and therefore even asked him for forgiveness for not being able to live up to his expectations and hopes. She asked him not to regard her as his wife, regardless of whether he became emperor or not. The man then replied that he had been nominated to be the next emperor, and getting rid of the Klonoa family's curse was a great achievement. Looking her straight in the face, he said that she was the one who had solved this problem, but he did not understand why she categorically rejected his proposal, which was mutually beneficial for them. Rooney then replied that they had married under the direction of the church oracle, and he had survived the curse. She had already fulfilled the role that had been assigned to her, so she saw no point in staying any longer. At that moment, she turned around and started to leave, but the man was not happy with this turn of events. He shouted at her and was about to say something, but did not have time, because for the safety of her children, she decided to lie to him and said that he was not their father. As soon as Hayden heard this, he was very surprised. The girl then smiled and said that she did not have the necessary qualities to be the emperor's wife because she had an affair with another man. She turned around again and was about to leave when she suddenly heard a quiet and uncertain voice of a man who asked in a trembling voice, "Is this really true?" She remembered his words back at the Duke's estate about how he didn't want her to lie to him, but clutching the blanket to her chest, she said it was true. The girl also asked if she could now return to the mansion, since it was cold outside and she would like to be closer to the children. At that moment, the man wanted to touch her hair, but he held back. He understood that it would be unnecessary and inappropriate, so he simply replied that she could come back. When he saw that she was moving away, he already wanted to say something to the girl about the plot of flowers, but changed his mind. The girl was called, so she turned around, but when she saw that he was not going to tell her anything more, she simply went back to the estate. When Rooney started to come in, she didn't see that her children were looking out the window at that moment. They were very happy that she was finally coming back. One of the boys also said that he was very glad that this strange duke was not near her, because he was not the most pleasant person for them. When Uranus started running away from the window, his brother asked what they were going to do tomorrow. The boy replied that first of all, they needed to get a weapon. Helios immediately became wary. He said that he doubted his fencing skills, and therefore did not want to let his brother down in such an important mission. The boy said that in that case, he would explore the mansion and gather the necessary information. This was also important. It would help him. He also said that at this time, Uranus would be engaged in battle with the Duke, and everyone would be in their place. The boy lay down on the bed. When his brother came up to him, he said that at that moment, Helios would have the opportunity to escape with his mother. This was their best escape plan, so they should definitely stick to it. They had to free their mother from this evil Duke. The boys really felt responsible, fulfilling such an important role. Rooney, meanwhile, continued to return to the estate, but she was no longer as happy as she would have liked. She kept thinking about the Duke's words and could not get them out of her head. The next morning, one of the brothers actually went to explore the mansion. The boy knew that this Duke was superior in absolutely everything. He was the force that supported Virgil's empire, both from the shadows and from the shadows, and Helios could not understand why such a man existed. He knew very well that this man was trying to make his mother his wife, but when he started comparing houses, he liked the master's house better. He would very much like to go back there, because he did not like this place at all, and he felt unsafe every time. When the boy looked out the window, he suddenly saw his brother running straight towards the Duke with a sword in his hands. Uranus shouted loudly and told the man to stop. The boy immediately turned his head to the side and saw a boy approaching him. Rooney's son approached the Demon King and said that he would defeat him in this contest. He also told the man to be ready. When he started to attack, Hayden simply stepped aside, and the guy immediately began to fall to the ground with this very heavy sword. Then the man turned to the boy and said that yesterday he had already suffered his defeat when he ran at him with a stick. He also said that he respected his courage. The man didn't have time to say anything else because Uranus screamed, saying that it was too noisy and that he wasn't going to listen to him at all. He stood up again and, waving his sword, said that he would protect his mother, but at that moment the sword simply fell out of his hands because the man pushed him very lightly in the shoulder. Hayden sighed heavily and said that he had quite a few weak points, and also added that he should never show his weaknesses to the enemy in the future. The guy managed to run up pretty quickly and take the sword from him, and Uranus couldn't believe that it really happened, because he didn't even have time to blink. Then he looked at him and, directing the sword, told him to remove all interference and aim at the opponent's vital points at close range. And after some time, the man was already directing the tip of the huge, sharp ball straight into the guy's chest. Of course, Uranus was very surprised. But then the man threw the sword in his direction and told him to try again. The boy looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant. However, when Hayden repeated it, he went and tried to do exactly the same thing. At that moment, the man made him some remarks and said that he was doing well. But next time he should try to lower his posture a little. The tip of the sword should be held as high as possible. The Duke also said that the blows should be unpredictable, so that his opponent could not dodge. Uranus took all these comments into account, and in the blink of an eye he was pointing his sword at the man, just as he had shown. Of course, Hayden was a very strong and agile warrior, so he managed to move the tip of the sword away in time so that it would not hurt him. However, he praised the guy, said that it was a very good job. Smiling, he looked the boy straight in the eyes and said that even an adult might not have time to dodge such a blow, so he made the greatest progress. Hayden also told the guy that he could use his skills right now, and added that he believed that Uranus had some kind of gift for fencing. He came closer to the boy and asked him in surprise if he had really taken out that long sword to show him his strength. When he nodded his head in agreement, the man suggested that in that case, they pick a sword that would better suit his skills and weight category, since this one was too big for him. When Hayden looked at his angry expression, he was surprised to ask if he was okay at all, because he didn't understand what was happening. But Uranus replied that he did not understand why the man himself was giving him this, since he was going to kill him with this sword. The man then smiled and said that if this was really so, then he would have to train him every day so that he could do it, because otherwise he definitely wouldn't be able to do it. Some time passed from that moment, and Helios met with his mother, and they went out to get some fresh air, because it was quite warm outside. Rooney noticed that something was wrong with him. She even assumed that he was not feeling well, because the boy looked very upset, and she did not know what to do about it. Then, smiling, she asked the boy if he was sure he didn't want to invite his brother on this walk, because the three of them could even play something, because the weather was simply gorgeous and allowed them to do so. However, the guy, still looking very sad, said that he did not know where Uranus was now, so he did not call him. When Rooney heard this, she was very surprised. She even assumed that the boys had quarreled and did not know what to do then. After some time, they came out of the gate, and when Helios saw what was there, he was simply delighted. Right in front of him, a whole field with beautiful flowers and trees opened up. Nearby, he said with admiration that this flower garden was simply delightful, and he had never seen anything like it in his life. He ran up to one of the flowers and told his mother that there were incredibly beautiful flowers in that place, and also asked if he could make a wine out of them. The woman who remained standing near the entrance suddenly became thoughtful. She understood that someone was taking care of them with great love, and this was quite unusual, because often no one looked after the gardens, and if they did, it was without care. In fact, last night, when she went out to talk to her husband, she didn't notice it at all. However, 7 years ago there was no flower garden at all in this place. Everything looked dull and gloomy. But now everything has completely changed. Of course, Rooney was very surprised, and she even became curious about who planted all this. Some time passed since then, and the girl and her son had already begun to return back to the estate, where she met her husband and second son. When Uranus saw them, he immediately ran closer to them and began to show his brother his sword, said that it was now his property, and this weapon was incredibly cool and even professional. But the boy did not look as happy as his brother. The guy turned to Helios and said that if he also wanted one, he could turn to this gentleman, and he would definitely give it to him. But Helios did not listen to him. He shouted loudly, saying that he did not need all this, and also ran away in the other direction. His brother ran after him, not understanding what was happening at all and why he reacted that way. Rooney, in fact, was very surprised herself. She sighed heavily, said that she would like to express her gratitude in advance. Hayden looked at her in surprise and immediately asked, "Is she talking about the sword?" The girl confirmed this, but said that she would return it as soon as they left this place, since she could not take it with her. However, the man insisted on his own and said that he could not take it back because the sword now belonged to Uranus, and only he had the right to dispose of it. He also told the girl that her son was incredibly skilled in fencing, and that he only needed to study a little and he would become a truly magnificent knight. After this, the man moved closer to her and asked again if she was sure that these two children were not his, because he was already beginning to doubt her words. At this very time that same evening, some rather surprising news was brought to Father Rooney's estate for him. Her half-brother's butler got hold of information that the girl had returned back to the Klonoa family, and as soon as the man heard this, he was very surprised. He asked the men if it was true. The butler bowed and said that it was definitely her. There could be no mistakes. Then he poured himself some tea and said that this was still very strange, because he was sure that they would get divorced based on a certain period of marriage. But even after the head of the family turned 30, Rooney never returned. She pretended to be on holiday in a neighboring country, but ended up staying in his house somehow, and this made the man incredibly angry. In a rough voice, looking somewhere to the side, he said that he simply had to return her, because after all, she was part of Persephone's family, and also his sister. Of course, Rooney responded to her husband's question that they were not his children, because she did not want to put herself or her beautiful children in danger. But still, Hayden turned around and said that she still lies a lot and he can't trust her, so he would like to take some action. The girl, lowering her head, said that if he didn't believe her, then there was no point in continuing this conversation, because they would only quarrel and waste a lot of time. In fact, she was shocked to see Damage and Hedis together, because they looked incredibly similar to each other. Rooney then confessed to him that 7 years ago she had been his wife, only a year, so her job as his bride was to end his curse, and she had successfully accomplished that task. The girl had already started to leave, but Hayden caught up with her and grabbing her hand, asked her to wait. And then, looking her straight in the eyes, he asked if she could somehow prove that these two were not his children. Rooney was tired of these constant arguments and told Mr. Helios that she wanted to know if he could prove that he was the father of these children. The girl did not think it necessary to bother herself, so letting go of his hand, she said that if he could not do it, then she asked him to simply divorce her, and they would not create even more trouble for each other. She explained that they were not going to stay in this estate for long, so she would very much like him to prepare the document as soon as possible. But then suddenly, when she was about to leave, she stopped and said that she would like to inquire who owned the flower garden that they had seen the previous evening behind the house. When she turned to Hayden for an answer, he smiled and asked, "Was she there again?" The girl didn't respond to this, because she understood that he already knew and understood everything, so she didn't want to lie even more. At this point, Helios ran into the estate's garden and hid behind a fence. He was irritated by the fact that Uranus was a deceiver and did not understand why he had become friends with the unkind Duke. The boy considered this a betrayal on the part of his brother because he had promised to help their mother. And now, on the contrary, he even accepts gifts from this unknown and evil man. In his mind, he turned to the gentleman with whom he was accustomed to living. Tears appeared in his eyes, and he would very much like to return home to his usual life and forget all this as a bad dream. At that moment, a man suddenly appeared behind him. He grabbed the bars and, turning to the little boy, said that he needed to clarify something with him. Helios immediately jumped up. He was very scared. Then he looked at the man and was ready to scream. But this stranger turned to him and asked him if it was true that he was the child of a servant. And he also asked if there was a woman named Rooney in this estate. At that moment, Nike was standing in front of him, and he looked very worried. The boy was very scared. His whole body was shaking, and he asked what he was even saying. But Nike had already made sure, saying that he believed she was indeed in the estate. He also asked to tell the boy if she was going out for a walk that evening. He continued to stand near the fence and asked if they had any set time for going out into the garden. The boy looked at him in surprise and said that he did not understand anything at all. But then suddenly Nike said in a quiet voice that he was very sorry that such a duke had captured her. He also called her a poor thing and, clearing his throat, looked at him again. Helios was a rather naive person, so he naturally believed this man, especially after his brother betrayed him. At that very moment, Rooney was already in her bedroom getting ready for bed. Suddenly, Uranus came in and, turning to her mother, asked if Helios had come back. The woman, hearing this, was very surprised and asked what he meant. The boy said in a sad voice that it was time for bed, but he still had not appeared in his room, so he was very worried. Uranus also said that he had a watch, so he simply had to know what time it was, and that it was already time for bed. But the woman, as soon as she heard that her son had not returned home, was already in a panic. She could not believe that Helios had really disappeared. As soon as the boy spoke to this stranger, he began to return to the estate with tears in his eyes. He understood that he had to act urgently because he had no other choice. Helios also believed that he needed to get into the carriage and head to the master, because only he could help them in such a difficult situation. Running through the forest, he suddenly stopped and looked at his watch. In fact, he had read in one of the books that a watch could be used instead of money. It was a gift given to him by the master. But for the sake of his mother, he was ready to sacrifice it. However, because the boy was running very fast, he was unable to restrain himself and, tripping, began to fall straight into the abyss that was nearby. While he was falling, he understood perfectly well that under such circumstances, he would simply die and did not know what to do, because this had never happened to him before. He didn't even have anything to grab onto. He was flying so fast, and there wasn't even a single tree around that could help him. While the guy was flying down, he didn't understand how he could not notice this gorge in the rock, and also thought that most likely there could be stones below, and if he ran into them, it would be incredibly painful. Helios was afraid of this the most. He was too scared, and because of this fear and shock, he could not even say a word, let alone scream. While he was flying down, he really hoped that someone would help him. But at that moment, when he was already ready to fall on the rocks and get incredibly injured, this did not happen. The guy hung in the air, literally a centimeter from the ground. He immediately opened his eyes and was very surprised. He even thought that he could fly. However, at that moment, he suddenly heard someone's voice above, who said that he had found him, and also, turning to the boy, added that he would now lift him up. Helios, looking up at that moment, saw before him that very hated Duke, from whom he would very much like to get rid. He didn't have time to do or say anything, when suddenly Hayden turned to him and told him not to move, because otherwise it would be worse, and after that, using his magical abilities, he began to lift him up, and in a few seconds he was in his hands. The guy couldn't believe that this Duke really helped him and saved his life, and also got him out of this canyon. After this, he heard the voice of his mother, who was very worried. She ran to them and was ready to strangle her son in her arms. When she ran up to the Duke and saw that he was okay, she immediately asked what had happened, but also added that she was very glad that he was okay. When Hayden saw her in a panic, with tears in her eyes and heavy breathing, he wanted to calm her down. He told her that they were lucky that it all ended like this, and that everything would be okay. He had already reached out his hand to hug her, but he didn't have time to do anything because Helios ran first and hugged her, crying again. After everything had calmed down, the boy turned to the Duke and, in a trembling voice, thanked him for saving him. However, the man replied that he shouldn't pay so much attention to it because it wasn't only his merit. Hayden explained that when he rushed forward, his falling speed was already reduced by magic. That's why he managed to do everything in time. He explained to the boy and his mother that most likely during the fall, due to severe stress, he used magic more subconsciously and thus was able to save his life. Looking the boy straight in the eyes, he answered in a confident voice that he really did have a gift for magic, because if he didn't, he wouldn't have survived, because Hayden wouldn't have had time to do it. As soon as the boy heard this, he couldn't believe his ears. He asked with a trembling voice if he really had a gift for magic. He certainly hoped so, but he couldn't believe that it could be true. After that, they all calmed down and headed back towards the estate. The Duke, walking ahead, told them to follow him closely and not to stray anywhere, because there could be a lot of danger in this place, so it was better not to take risks. Rooney, as soon as she heard that her second son had a talent for magic, immediately remembered a passage from the book. It said that the man from the earth was an excellent swordsman, and the dragon from the sky had outstanding skill in magic. And this was precisely the power that the Klonoa family inherited, and since these children are his, it is quite natural that they both inherited something of their own. One boy, fencing and swordsmanship, and the other, magic. As they walked forward, Helios suddenly noticed that his mother was a little sad and immediately asked her for forgiveness for his behavior. He looked into her eyes and said that he wanted to go to the master and ask him to take them back. But now he realized that it was too reckless, dangerous, and wrong, so he asked her forgiveness again. Rooney was silent for a moment. Even though he was only 7, he still wanted to get to the neighboring state on his own, and she admired that. She was even surprised by the fact that he had thought about all this for so long, and had come to the decision that he should go and talk to the gentleman himself, even though he hardly knew the way there and knew that it could be very dangerous. And besides, he had not warned his family and friends. She squeezed his hand tighter and realized that no matter what their roots, she still had to divorce Hayden as soon as possible. For the sake of her children, she must sacrifice, perhaps even her happiness. They returned to the estate quite safely, and the children immediately went to bed because they were very tired. Before the next morning, the butler came to Rooney, bowed, asked her forgiveness for the inconvenience, but said he had a letter for her. The girl looked at him in surprise and asked, "Is that really true? After all, no one has ever sent her a letter." She even thought about what the Lord had written to her, but when she opened it, she immediately realized that her assumption was wrong. It was a letter from her brother. It said that he heard that she was undergoing treatment, but apparently she was okay now. Nike also wrote that they were having an anniversary banquet soon, so she should prepare. He also added that they had come that day, the people, their carriage for her, so she should come. After that, she saw another bundle of paper in the envelope and immediately thought that it was perhaps some kind of message or invitation. The second letter said that he felt that things were not going well for the Duke, and if she really wanted a divorce, he could help her escape from family interference. As soon as Rooney read about it, she was absolutely horrified. In fact, she did not want to deal with this disgusting family at all, because they always humiliated her, insulted her, and did not want her there. However, if she gets support from her brother, she might be able to divorce Mr. Helios without any problems and very quickly. Of course, this made her think seriously, even though she hated her brother with all her soul. Meanwhile, Helios, walking through the estate, suddenly heard the Duke address him, and the man asked the boy if he would like to begin studying magic in a more professional manner so that he could use it for his own purposes. As soon as he heard about this, he was very surprised, but did not have time to give his answer, because the man, interrupting him, replied that he would not force him, but if it became interesting, then of course he would help him. At that moment, Helios remembered the words the man had said the night before, that he really had a gift for magic, and he believed him. So now it was very difficult for him to make a decision. After a moment of silence, the boy said that he really liked magic, but he did not want to learn it from the Duke. The man, having listened to him attentively, said that he understood everything. After that, he began to take something out of his pocket. When he took out one thing, which he immediately handed to the boy, when Helios lowered his head down, he saw a small golden key and immediately asked the man what it was and what it was for. Hayden explained that there was a library on the first floor of the West Building, and it contained books, almost all of which were devoted to magic. So the man explained that if he suddenly wanted to, he could come there at any time and use them. At this time, Rooney, also with a letter, was brought a box containing a pink dress. She was surprised by this gift from her brother. These were dresses and accessories that reminded her of the things that 10-year-old girls wear. Even though she was married, her family still didn't know that she had children of her own, and they were convinced that she would always remain a little child who didn't know anything. The girl couldn't figure out what to do, and to distract herself a little, she decided to take a walk around the estate. Of course, discussing divorce with Mr. Hayden is a separate issue, and perhaps she will be able to convince him if she gets support from her brother. But she really didn't want to cross paths with him or meet him in any way because it was just torture. When Rooney suddenly heard a crash, she looked to the side and saw her son, who was carrying a lot of books in his hands and tripping, spilled them on the floor. At first, she was a little surprised, but asked if he needed help. Helios didn't want to lie to his mother, so he answered that the books were from the Duke's library. He had given him permission to borrow them, so he took several copies. As soon as the woman heard this, she was really very surprised, but she began to help the boy collect the books so that it would be easier for him to carry them. Seeing her expression like that, Helios suddenly stood up and shouted at her, saying that he wasn't friends with him in society. It was just that Uranus was constantly training with a sword, and he was very lonely, so he wanted to somehow occupy himself. Rooney then handed him a stack of several books and asked, "Does he really like them so much that he even bought so many copies for himself?" At that moment, the boy felt a little ashamed of himself for yelling at his mother, so he said in a sad voice that he really loved books and reading, learning something new. In fact, when Rooney was still very little, she also often came to the library. She really liked the books. But that was not all. She mainly came there to hide from her horrible older brother, who constantly pestered her.